Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Letter of Law. My name is Sarthak, and today I am absolutely delighted, honored, and thrilled to be in conversation with one of the foremost litigators based out of Delhi, Ms. Shyel Trehan. Ma'am obviously requires no introduction, but just in case you've been living under a rock for some reason, I'll give a very quick introduction about ma'am. Ma'am graduated from NLS Bangalore back in 2000, worked in the law chambers of Justice Indu Malhotra. Thereafter, went to the USA, obtained her LL.M from Columbia, worked for a couple of years in law firms based out of USA, and has been practicing in courts and tribunals around Delhi ever since. Ma'am, thank you so much for taking the time out and being here with me today, first of all.
It's a pleasure, Sarthak. Lovely to be here.
Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, so the introduction I gave of you is based on the information one can find about you online, but I'm curious to know how would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Oh, well, that's a tough question, but I think more than anything, I define myself really as a litigator. I knew very early on that I wanted to be, I never did a corporate internship when I was in law school. I did very, very focused on disputes and wanting to do dispute resolution practice. So I think now when I see today's kids, I feel very blessed to have actually known what I want to do, because today people really struggle with just finding what their purpose in life is. I think somehow that purpose fell into my lap very early on. And so it's been sort of a very exciting journey in that sense.
Wow, that's interesting. I'd like to start from there, ma'am. How did you realize that litigation is something you always wanted to do? Were you also told as a student in school that you're good at debating, so maybe you should become a lawyer?
I always, when you're in school or even when you first join law school, you have a vision of what a lawyer is and what a lawyer does. And in those days, particularly, and these are the days before cable TV and suits and things like that, you always thought of lawyers as litigators, people who were in court. Um, in fact, I think most of us in the early years, I mean, I went to law school in 1995,
Hmm.
had a very poor idea of what a corporate or transactional lawyer really does. I think now there's a lot more awareness. Everybody understands their choices really well. But at that, my vision of who a lawyer is and what a lawyer does was very much a person addressing a courtroom. And in my head, it's kind of stuck to that. I did do some capital markets work when I was in America. And I mean, I realized also fairly early on that it wasn't what I loved.
Right. Ma'am, because most of our viewers are law students and fresh lawyers who enter the bar, one question that I get requested a lot to ask my guests on the show is that this switch from being a law student to a lawyer it happens very fast and it's a little hard to take into. And no matter how rigorous your law school, how many internships you did, handling the real responsibility of a lawyer, working on tight deadlines, can be a bit hard. Was that something you also experienced when you started practicing after law school?
So I think what really defines your first 5 years as a lawyer is the mentors you have. And a lot of what I advise law students or young lawyers is choose your first job carefully based on who is going to be mentoring you. It defines your entire career moving forward. It'll
Mm.
define your work ethic. It will define how people, how you're taught. There are some bosses you will have. So my first boss was in Malhotra. Every draft we did was marked over with a red pen and handed back to us. And these were the days when there's one computer in the whole office. We didn't have our
Okay.
own personal computer. So everyone would dictate to a steno, you take your draft to her, hand it over in a hard copy. I still do that with everybody who works with me today. Even though I could, it's quicker for me to give a markup on a computer, make the changes myself. I don't do that because I feel when they feed in the changes, they actually learn. If I just give them a markup and say, these are my changes, it's not really going to get hardwired into their systems. So I think that the first thing, it is a very big transition from being a law student to a lawyer. And you're expected to suddenly be an adult with responsibilities and deliver to a client who has a lot at stake.
Yeah.
So it's the first 3 or 4 years are very high pressured in the sense of you're very young and you need somebody to guide you. So I think my first sort of piece of advice to young lawyers and how to make that transition less rocky is find a great mentor, hang on to that mentor. Even if you move on to another job, keep in touch with your mentor. Feel free to check in with them regularly and say, look, I find myself in this position. What do I do? And the other thing that the mentor defines, other than work ethic, and also the quality of your work gets set by your first mentor always, or your first boss always, is also the ethics, the professional ethics.
Mm-hmm.
Lawyers are presented with very, very funky situations on a day-to-day basis. And knowing what is right, what is wrong, what is the right moral compass to establish your moral compass, really, your value system in the profession. That's the other thing that's very important. So I think in finding the person you are going to find your first job with, these are the two most important things. Will they teach you? Will they mentor you? Do they have an interest in how their people from their chamber progress moving forward? And most importantly, setting the ethical compass.
Right. Ma'am, you used a very interesting word and you said that lawyers are faced with funky situations on a daily basis. I'll come to that in a bit. But it was interesting to me how you talked about drafts. When you start drafting at the initial ages, at the initial time, they came back to you marked with red lines. And uh, as a young lawyer, I think some of us also sit and talk that, you work so hard on a draft, you get very invested in it, you send it to your senior, and of course, it's going to get demolished and changed. But how do you not take that personally? How do you not let it affect and hurt you, and you actually learn from it and move forward and get better as a drafts person?
So the first time you see your draft covered in red, you're a bit shocked because you
Yeah.
think you did a great job. And I'll tell you something funny. When I went to the US, I was there for a while, came back in 2007, and I had last worked in my first job in 2003. And my former chamber actually was very kind and brought me back into cases that I had worked on because they still weren't finished.
Wow.
When I went for my LL.M, worked in America and came back. And when I saw some of those drafts that I had made, I was like, oh my God. So, what does happen is it's a shock initially. So with my associates, colleagues, what I try to do to cushion the shock a bit is to say, look, this is what happened in my first job. I'm doing this to you to help you become a better lawyer.
Hmm.
So we start on that sort of cushioning the blow a little bit by explaining why this is happening to them. And slowly, I mean, my goal when somebody's worked with me by the third year should be that the draft is very lightly marked up. That's when I feel they are ready to fly. It takes that long. The first year somebody is with me, mostly I'm teaching them. The second year and third year is when they're really able to sort of take ownership over their cases, what they're doing, come up with ideas. So the first year is just a very sort of steep learning curve. So I think, and look, litigation is tough in the sense of on any given day, no matter how much you've progressed in the profession, you have to have a slightly thick skin because, even within the office, people may care about your feelings, but that's not going to happen when you're facing a judge. And so, those are also moments when you're a young lawyer and you're facing a courtroom where you may be fairly sort of not prepared for the treatment that you get. And slowly you see, the best in the profession having a slightly thick skin, being able to sort of weather the punches, bounce up and move on. So that's an important skill for all litigators in any case and for transactional lawyers. I mean, they're not put through any less rigorous teaching process. And small mistakes that creep into a contract can cost you very heavily. So I think why for young lawyers, there's a lot of pressure on day one of their professions is small mistakes can result in a very, very big consequence for a client. And that's both on the corporate side and on the litigation side. So I don't believe in throwing my associates into the deep end.
I see.
Because what does happen, or my colleagues are into the deep end, because what does happen is it's too much pressure for them, and it is the cost is too high for the litigant or the client in a corporate situation. So I think people really do have to, I think you have to take ownership over mentorship as you get older in the profession.
Yes, ma'am. And ma'am, again, just coming back to what you were talking about, when you said that when an associate is working in a chamber, the senior and at the chamber can take some steps to protect them, but inside the court, the people are basically on their own. And that leads me to my next question, because when one is sent to court by their senior, no matter for how small, I think it could be something as trivial as taking a Passover or an adjournment. But when you're standing before the court, it feels like everybody's eyes are right at you and they're just going to snap at you. I was wondering, ma'am, when you started out and when you started going to courts independently initially, was there some sort of inhibition in your mind? And if yes, how did you overcome it?
Oh, absolutely. I think there is on everyone. And I started in Supreme Court. So
I
that
see.
was a very, very scary environment. And it was 25 years, 24 years ago. So it was also a different court. Now, there is a big sort of push to encourage young lawyers. It's far more gender neutral than it was earlier. And there were excellent judges then also who were, but there was also, it was very hierarchical then, much more so than it is now. Now you see a lot more young people addressing the court, which is lovely. But I have really, my first few experiences were mentioning matters, taking adjournments, passovers. But again, what my senior at that time, who's Indu Malhotra, said and did, and I still do it with my juniors, was she made me practice. She
Ah,
actually would sit across a table from me and say, Shyel,
wow.
what are you going to say when you mention this matter? How are you going to ask for this adjournment? So when I went there, she had already prepared me on how to string those sentences together. Now things can go way off piste from what you've prepared. You may ask for an adjournment and the judge may look at you and say, no, you know what, you argue today. So there were two really important things she taught me. One was, even if you're going for the smallest thing, read your file. Know your file inside out, even if you're going for a Passover or adjournment. Do not walk into that courtroom thinking, I'm only going for this, and not know your file, because you don't know how that hearing is going to go. And this, I see junior lawyers get trapped in this almost every day.
Yes.
And so that's one. And the second one was actually making me practice the smallest of things in front of her before I went into the courtroom. And I thought that was fantastic because it really, sort of gave you the confidence, taught you the language, how you were supposed to address the court. And so I was really handheld in the best possible way for the first 3 years of my practice. And I try to bring that to my office as well now. I don't know if I've done as good a job of it as she did, but it's definitely the goal.
That's phenomenal. Ma'am, so for instance, when you say that one should be ready with their file when they go to court, I'm curious to know what exactly does that mean? How does one be so familiar with the file that you can talk the judge through whatever the judge needs to know? How does one start thinking about preparing the file inside out as a young lawyer?
So I think the first thing is reading. You have to read the file cover to cover. Nothing replaces an actual reading of all the pleadings from beginning to end, no matter how long it is. So that's one. And now a young lawyer may be faced with a situation that the morning of the matter, senior goes and says, listen, now you go ask for a Passover, and they haven't had time to read the file.
Yes.
So one is read the whole file if you have the benefit of time. The second is if you're put in a difficult position where you literally don't have the time, uh, read at least and this, when I worked with Mr. Jaitley, one of the things that I saw he did in every conference was he would start with, and he was mostly doing Supreme Court matters at the time, he'd start with the impugned order. He'd say, show me the impugned order and show me all the documents.
Hmm.
He'd come to what was said in the SLP actually at the end of the conference. But first, he would do a very detailed reading of the impugned order and all the corresponding documents that it referred to. So I think one of the things you do have to do is, even if, and lawyers have to pick up speed reading. because sometimes you don't have enough time to read. Sometimes you're in a case and a very heated argument is going on between parties, and you're handed a document by the other side in that moment saying, but look at this. And you're reading it in court for the first time. So one of the skills that's important for young lawyers is to be able to read fast. And the only way to read fast is to actually have read a lot, that reading, the practice of reading. And I was seeing something very interesting recently on statistics of how many people, this was done on US college campuses, but how many people had read for fun? Anything, read magazines, books, whatever it is. How many people entering undergrad had a reading habit which was recreational? Because that eventually can determine how fast you can read even in the professional workspace, because you're just good at reading. And one of the things that was interesting was that in 20 years ago or 30 years ago, before so much social media and all of that, the majority of the kids had read at least 5 books in the last year before they came to joined college. And now that number has shrunk drastically to a minority of the students having read for fun.
Wow.
So one of the things for lawyers is, if you're a young lawyer, read a lot, read voraciously. If you're a law student, and it can be anything that you like, but when words come fast to you and they come easy to you, reading your briefs gets fast too, and it comes with practice. And the idea of a shortcut is a very bad one. So if you think that, oh, this is a very long brief, now let me try to figure out just reading the synopsis, there are surprises at every part of these briefs. So reading is literally your best friend in every possible situation as a young lawyer.
Ma'am, do you find the time to read for fun now?
Much less now than I did earlier. I try to, but I'm definitely not running through the number of books I did earlier. And also, when you read as a profession, it's very difficult to make reading your recreational sort of space when you've been in front of pages all day. But
That's true.
on holiday, I definitely always read.
What kind of stuff do you enjoy reading, ma'am?
Fiction, non-fiction, bunch of things. I just picked up a book the other day, which I'm very curious about, called Butter. It's a
Yes.
piece of Japanese fiction. I have no idea what it's going to be like, but my goal is to read it during the Dussehra holidays.
Oh, okay.
It's
Great,
looking
great.
hopeful.
Absolutely. Now, ma'am, a couple of questions, and I'd like to sort of go back to your initial years when you finished your 3 years in practice and you decided to move to US for your LLM. Now, that's a very interesting decision because once a person has already spent around 3, 4 years, and this kind of conversation I have with my university seniors, they say, we're thinking of an LLM, but we don't know whether it's right to take that year off when we are starting to do well in the profession and go and study and then come back and start again. What was your thinking like when you went to do an LLM, and is it worth it to sort of carve an year out after having spent some years in the profession to go and read and study and learn again?
So I look at it in two different ways. I think the first is disappearing for a year when you're in practice, actually, at the end of the whole thing, is a very small amount of time. Things don't change that much in a year. So when you, whether you're thinking of doing an LLM back to back with your LLB, or whether you say that, look, I want to do it after a few years of work experience, my suggestion is to do it after a few years of work experience, only because you're kind of ready for that change of gears. You're ready for something new. You will also appreciate being back in a classroom much more after 3 years of work than you do back to back with your LLB. But at the same time, I know a lot of scholarships come up while you're in law school. So, you should grab those opportunities, because it doesn't make sense to, when you're in the academic space and people are applying for scholarships and things like that, and that's the sort of sweet spot for you to apply, you should do it for sure. I don't think you lose a huge, there's a professional hit you take by going away for a year. I think you learn a lot there and you come back. So I think that's fine. Does it hugely impact your work as a lawyer in India? No. So, does it change the jobs you can get, the job opportunities? So I would dissuade people from taking debt to do it. If you're going to take a loan to do it and expect to, your salary is going to be the same whether you have an LLM or not. So your career trajectory may be exactly the same. It's great exposure, but I would not take a financial burden for it, because you will find that very hard to recoup if you don't get a job there thereafter. And getting jobs as an LLM is not easy.
Yes.
You can get very lucky and get a job, but you can also, the large majority of LLM students land up going back to their home countries.
Uh,
So that's kind of where I would place
right.
it, just to say, if it's great exposure. If it's not financially difficult to do, it's a wonderful thing to do. Yes, go ahead, do it. Nothing will change in that 1 year of you being away. If you get a job there, take a few years and get that work experience. It's a different work experience. You'll learn a lot. And then you decide whether you want to come back or not. For me, I always felt that India was my karma bhumi,
Right.
always. So I knew I would come back. But some people may not.
Hmm. That's right, ma'am. And ma'am, it's interesting. So when you returned to India and you set up your chambers in partnership early on, what was your thinking like behind setting up your first chambers? Did you have a fair bit of clients at that time, or were you expecting that people will flow in eventually? What was your thinking behind setting up your own chambers all those years
So
ago?
when I returned to India, I joined the chambers of Mr. Arun Jaitley.
I
I
see.
worked with him, and he was, and I think you'll see this with a lot of people who worked with him. One, he took great pride in how people from his chambers did.
Hmm.
He would always he really wanted to make sure that you were succeeding in the profession. So one of the things, I was working with him and I set up my own practice, and he told me, he said, look, until you have 12 hours of work of your own in your office, you will still keep coming here.
Hmm.
And the idea of that was, one, you don't break your work ethic. And
Hmm.
the second one is that you stay in circulation. So he gave me the space and time to do my own work, yet the sort of protective atmosphere of being attached to his chamber and having work at his office. And he used to work till very late at night. So he used to work till 10, 11 on a fairly regular basis. So I could actually do work in my office with the first few clients I got, all of that, come back to his chamber. And he'd ask me, how many cases did you have a
Wow.
day? So he was extremely supportive. He encouraged me to take on some government work. So I did the MCD panel in those days, to start to argue in court. He said, if you want to be an arguing counsel, you have to do one of these government panels, because you'll get so much experience addressing courtrooms. So that really, to me, was, so coming back, I had huge mentorship from him. I had the support of being able to set up. And honestly, when we set up our chambers, maybe it was the time at which it was, work just flew in.
Wow.
It was really, I mean, no complaints there. We had at any given time more work than we could. We were on a treadmill trying to service it.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
we were lucky with that. It was just good fortune, I think, and very supportive mentors in our lives that helped us do that.
That's incredible. But ma'am, still, if I'll probe a little further here, how does one go about this enigmatic thing of landing clients? I've had several litigators and counsels on my show, and I asked this question to everyone. Everyone gives different answers. Some are evasive, and I don't think they're evasive out of their own volition. It's just probably there isn't a set way. But how does one approach getting clients for their chamber and ensure that they keep coming back?
So I think you get a wide range of answers, because there is no answer to this for one. There's no sort of cookie cutter solution for this. I
Hmm.
think the space when Dia and I set up our practice, it was small. There weren't that many lawyers in the system. Now the number of young law graduates has just increased. So we didn't actually go out and hunt for work. It came to us. And I understand that it sounds, you sound like you're coming from a very privileged place that you didn't have to do that. I think it was that time. I understand now that it's not that easy for work to just walk into your office or come into your office. So I think it was a different time. It was a different time and space. I think the other thing we did to distinguish ourselves, and that was the idea with which we set up our chambers, is both of us had worked in corporate law firms. And the idea was to bring the professionalism and the work product that exists in a corporate law firm into litigation. And that at that time was an interesting concept. So clients would come in the first time and then see a different kind of service being given to them. And I think that then attracted more and more work, repeat clients, with more of their cases and things like that. So that was something that we set it up with the idea of providing something that was a different quality. The way the pleadings were drafted, the time we gave to everything. And that was something that was new and different, and bringing in that kind of big firm professionalism to a tiny chamber was something a bit new. So I think maybe it was a little bit of that. I think it was definitely, we didn't go out and hunt for work. I think we did definitely stay visible at all points of time. I mean, even when I had my kids, I was back in court in 3 months. So, you can't disappear when you're in litigation. Now it's, you're there for the long run. So I think it was a lot of that. For younger people now, I think it is a little bit of a different ballgame. But I think another thing that definitely worked in our favor was we were, I guess, at least 10 years into the profession before we set up our own practice. And 9 or 10 years. And I think that makes a big difference too. Right now, I'm seeing young lawyers with 3 years or 4 years of experience saying, I'm setting up my own chambers. And that's, to me, I feel a little bit early. I think if you do it too early, you're trying to sell yourself. I think once you've been in the profession for a long enough time, work will come to you. So the idea of doing it after 3 or 4 years, and I mean, we were both first generation. Maybe it works differently for legacy, when you have legacy and you have a parent in the profession or a grandparent in the profession where you feel that, that you will have a source of work. For us, we had none of that. So you're starting from scratch. I would say don't start too early. Start when you already have a little work of your own. Find an office, a mentor, which will let you do your own work in addition to their work. So you're not sitting in an empty office waiting for work to come. You should already have that work when you're setting up on your own.
Right. And ma'am, one of the things that I always keep hearing about how to get your own work is to somehow make yourself known. Now, obviously, people can't advertise in our profession, and one may not be very well inclined to become a LinkedIn warrior, so to speak, where they're posting out every adjournment that they get in court. So, how does a lawyer think about getting himself or herself known in the profession as a competent person willing to do work?
So, this is a very new concept to your generation of feeling you need to get known. When we joined the profession, the idea of getting known didn't exist. It was like work hard and build a reputation. And it was old school. There was no social media. There was no LinkedIn. There was nothing. I mean, you would get known only by meeting the same people in Supreme Court every day. It was all physical meeting. There was no digital space for this. And somehow I feel like we need to get back to that a little bit, which is people feeling that if you give yourself publicity, like you said, a LinkedIn warrior, or putting every adjournment of yours, or circulating a broadcast message on WhatsApp saying, I did all these cases, or to your entire list of contacts. I don't actually think that works. I think these are still building a litigation practice is a brief by brief, brick by brick practice. There are no shortcuts to this. I think you can do 100 interviews, you can post every adjournment of yours, you can want to be on TV talking about all kinds of different legal issues. But I don't think that's a substitute for actually having the volume of work in court. Nothing substitutes that. So you may be a household name outside, and there are any number of lawyers who have a sort of well known outside of the profession because they've done a lot of publicity for themselves. But to me, the key really is peer recognition.
Hmm.
How do your peers perceive you? How do your peers in the profession perceive you? That peer recognition is actually how you measure your success in a profession, and not from your number of followers on Instagram.
Right.
So I think that's something that kids these days or young lawyers these days really need to look at, not trying to find a shortcut to becoming well known.
Hmm.
You should not be well known in your 20s. You should be working day and night in your that's and then maybe in your late 30s you'll get a bit little well known. But if you're a 20 something lawyer, I had a young student come to me, and he wanted to be a lawyer. He was going to do CLAT, and it's a bright boy. And I said that this is a very, the gestation period is long,
Hmm.
so be prepared for that. And he said, no, but it will not be for me. So I said, why is that? And he's a first generation lawyer. I
Okay.
said, why do you feel that? And he said, because I'm going to file PILs and get famous.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I said, you do realize that's not going to make you famous. But, people see through that.
Yeah.
Uh, but that was something, he's in class 12 when he told me this. So, the perception that I need to get famous, so I need to get well known. I feel like get well known for hard work in the profession first. External recognition will only be that. It will only be that, yes, maybe you will get invited to a conference, maybe you will, but will that give you um, really the experience you need to be a good lawyer? I don't think so.
Hmm. That's a lot to think about, ma'am. And ma'am, moving forward, I start thinking about what you said earlier, that back then maybe there wasn't the kind of competition that exists today in terms of for young people to sort of get their own matters. And from my own experience, if one zooms out and looks at when one goes to court, and for instance in the high court, if one zooms out and not think about the brief for a second and look around, there's so many lawyers, everyone is competent, everyone is connected, everyone has the best clients, and one really feels, is there really enough work for everyone? And if there is, will it ever come my way? I'm just wondering, ma'am, have you ever thought about these questions?
Yes, because what's happening now, so everyone, when we entered the profession too, everyone was competent, but the number of people was tiny. And
Hmm.
to look at the number of law schools that exist and are churning out. So, when we went to law school, well, 1995, National Law School had graduated two batches. There was Delhi University, people had gone to GLC in Bombay. There was a handful of colleges, really. And in some sense, everyone who had been to Delhi University kind of knew each other. They had all interned with lawyers through their entire period. People from NLS Bangalore, a lot of them took corporate jobs. From my batch of 80, there are 3 litigators who actually took on litigation. The rest were all corporate lawyers. So the pool of people doing or litigating in the courts was small. And in those days, the big law firms didn't do that much litigation. So, now every big law firm has a very large disputes team.
No.
So now we're looking at Jindal producing a huge batch of lawyers, maybe 9, 10, I don't even know how many NLUs.
More
And
than
of
that.
course, Delhi University and all the other older law schools who are still churning out batches, Amity. So the number of law students in the system has just exploded. So yes, when you say, where is the work going to come from? I'm also seeing a lot of young lawyers hunting for jobs.
Hmm.
It's there are, I don't know what how this demand supply is going to finally work out, because India is a big market.
Hmm.
There is a lot of legal work, but there are a huge number of lawyers being churned into the system. And I think maybe that's where, when we graduated from law school, we didn't ask where will our clients come from. There were enough clients for everybody.
Hmm.
Now that I'm looking at it, I see why there's this angst and why there's this anxiety, because just the sheer number is huge.
But ma'am, do you think despite that fact, somehow there's going to be enough work for everyone, or there's going to be a scarcity?
So, I feel like if there's an equitable distribution of work amongst everybody and prices come down for litigants, that's always a good thing, right?
Mm.
If you have a large number of resources and litigation becomes more affordable for the common person, nothing wrong with that. So, if there is a correction in the demand and supply, and at the end of it all, but what I'm seeing is not that. I think the demand for the top is still huge. There are certain lawyers who are still hugely in demand and will continue to be in demand. And then there will be it's like a pyramid. And at the bottom of the pyramid, scarcity of work and people sort of trying to fall over each other to get that work. And I think one of the lovely things, at least at my time in litigation, is that, because there's enough work to go around, and at the end of the day, a litigator's colleagues are other lawyers in court.
Hmm.
They're your friends and they're your lifelong friends, and those are really important relationships. So if you start to think of that person as competition, you're going to lead a very sad and unhealthy life as a litigator, because really your colleagues are, I mean, the people in your office, we all have small chambers at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And your best friends in the profession are going to be the people who you meet in court every day. And those are truly, I mean, I've been blessed to have wonderful friends who I've met in court. And if, like you asked, you said if there's competition, I've never felt that. There's always been enough. And when we are at opposite sides of a case, it's fun. You walk out and you laugh together at the end of it all. I can see that, if kids are getting, or young lawyers are getting anxious about where their work is going to come from, it's also not healthy to feel that sense of competition between each other.
Yeah, that's true. And that's a really, really positive way to think about it also. I'm sure our viewers will find great value from it. Ma'am, moving on. Again, when one is just starting out, for instance, if I draft a new petition, I feel like I've learned something new. I've not done this before, so I've learned something. I'm working on a new area of law that I've never touched. Okay, again, I get a sense, okay, I've learned something new. But at your stage, ma'am, put in more than 2 decades into the profession, how do you sort of assess growth, and how do you ensure that I'm growing intellectually as a lawyer, growing financially, expanding my practice? What's your thinking like on these questions?
So this is something interesting, which is common for every lawyer from your first year of practice, probably till you retire or die.
Okay.
You will learn something new every day,
Mm.
because every case is different. Every case will be a new set of facts. And I think this is one of the things that attracted me to litigation, is your work is never repetitive. So every case is a learning process, no matter how much experience you have. Your experience may determine how you deal with it,
Mm.
your knowledge base on what to apply to it, but you are presented with a new puzzle on a daily basis, and that's really fun. So I think that that's the diversity of, and the interesting thing about being in litigation versus perhaps being a corporate lawyer also, where your set of facts changes only very marginally. But as a litigator, you may do, on any given day, you may do an intellectual property case, a case on some kind of, property. You may also do a shareholder dispute. And all this is in one day. You have sort of done, and maybe things will super specialize later on. And maybe in the next generation coming in, practice areas may become more super specialized. But in the commercial court practice today, we have a huge breadth of things that one is dealing with on a daily basis. And it also, being in litigation, gives you a huge sort of ability to do different kinds of work. So, I mean, while I do sort of, this is my daily bread and butter work, which is for shareholder dispute, property case, something in IP, something, a contract dispute. Somebody, a young lawyer may come to me one day with for labor unions and say, we want to do this kind of, will you appear in this for me? And so, it took me into a whole new area of law I didn't know.
Wow.
And also the ability to do sort of pro bono work in a way that I always wanted to, but it's not the only kind of work I do. So, you're happy to have that part of your practice area, which is cross-subsidized by sort of the bread and butter work. So it gives you the ability to pivot into all kinds of areas, which I think is just very unusual for any kind of profession.
Hmm. That's interesting. Ma'am, now I'll sort of shift my line of questioning and come to a different angle. Uh, because you're one of perhaps the most foremost commercial litigators based out of Delhi, I think your insights on this are going
Kind.
to no, no, absolutely. Ma'am, I speak with a lot of female friends uh, in the bar. Some of them are running very successful practice, but they struggle to land commercial clients and commercial matters. I'm wondering, ma'am, did you ever face this problem as well? And if yes, how did you sort of move past it and ensure that you keep getting these kind of briefs?
So that's a really good question because there are very few women on the counsel side, on the addressing the court side in commercial matters. And this is a problem world over. It's not just India. But I think the first thing I did to attract that kind of work was I did not take matrimonial cases.
Mm,
And a lot of people ask me why. They said, you'd be flooded with work if you did
yeah.
this. I said, that's exactly why I'm not doing it.
Uh,
Because as a female lawyer, if I start to take this kind of work, I'll be flooded and typecast, and it will be very hard for me to attract the good commercial. And not that that's not good, it's a great practice area. But if what you want to be is a commercial lawyer, if I start to mix it up with other practice areas, particularly ones that are perceived to be women centric, I may not be able to get that kind of work. And so I turned away a lot of briefs on that side, on the family law side.
mm,
Custody, matrimonial work, I sent it all away. I didn't do it. And it was difficult because you know what? Those are cases where they're well paying, you will get time in court, you will be briefed as the main counsel, all of that. So it was at that time, and male lawyers asked me, they were like, well, I do it. And Foremost senior counsels are doing it. Why would you say no? And it is a gender thing. Is the reason I said no was I didn't want to get typecast.
mm,
So one is that. And the second is, you know what, it is tough. Like I was reading a study, and it's a very interesting study, which was done in the US about lawyers who address the court. They did a gender comparison, and they started off by saying, in certain courtrooms over a period of time, they studied how many women spoke in court and how many were second or third chair. And they started off with a figure of approximately 24-25% had addressed the court out of the total. Then they did a further study, which is or further analysis to say how many were representing the government in those cases and how many were engaged by a private client. And
mm,
the number went down to around 15 or 14% private clients. Then they did an analysis on commercial disputes and how many $1 million was at stake. And when they went into the highest end of how much money was at stake, it came to 1%. So there is a perception that people would like a gray-haired or bald man representing them in court, because that's the vision, right? That you have an elderly gentleman addressing the court for you. I think that's changed. And I've been very, very lucky where the Delhi High Court is, I think, the most gender neutral court in the country by far. And I think how it changes is that you have judges who are as receptive to a woman as a man. They are as receptive to a middle-aged woman as they are to a middle-aged man. And that is the big game changer, I feel, today. So when, young women are worried or anxious about, in this practice area, I'm not getting work. They are right to be anxious. There are very few women in that field. And I don't have a magic prescription for it, but one of them was this, that I didn't do family law. And I think the second was that you really just have to spend the time, dig your heels in. If you're practicing in Delhi, you're very fortunate. You have an excellent, excellent gender neutral platform. Use it.
mm.
It's not available everywhere else. So, that to me is just jump in the deep end, you will swim.
I see. Ma'am, does it somehow change as you become more established in the profession? For instance, if it's a young counsel who anyway faces the burden of being a young counsel, so as to not get commercial briefs. And in addition to that, some being a woman is a further impediment in landing corporate clients. So I'm wondering, as you move forward, uh, does that help because you're now more established, you're more well known, you're renowned to do good work? So does that perception that looking at a lawyer from that gendered lens sort of change, or does it still remain?
It absolutely changes. So I think it is, and I say this to a lot of young lawyers that, when I was one of the very few people who used to be like pregnant in court. Like I worked till the day I delivered both my children. And it was almost a curiosity to people, like, why are you here? And there were women before me who did this and stuck in the profession and did extremely well. And I remember people like Zia Modi and Justice Pratibha Singh saying, we were back in court 2 weeks after our children. And, so they were the trailblazers, really.
Okay.
And so but there were moments when I didn't feel like I could stand up for myself. So, if I said that, look, it's 4:30, my baby is 2 weeks old, I need to go home. I thought 100 times before saying that in an open courtroom. I found it very difficult to say, look, don't give this date because you know what, I'll probably be out of commission for a few months. I absolutely did not feel comfortable asking somebody for a chair if I'd been standing for 3 hours.
Hmm.
And because I was young and I really felt like, I have to be genderless here because I have to, and if I say anything, it's going to affect my career.
Hmm.
And now when I look back, I didn't feel empowered enough to do it then. Now I would do it for other people. I don't have to do it for myself. But I do feel like with age and experience comes a lot of the ability to stand up for yourself. And also people do treat you differently. So, but the pyramid narrows. If I see the number of young female lawyers in court in their sort of 20s, and you look at how many people are there in their 40s, 50s, and then 60s, it is really, it narrows between 20 and 40. The ones who cross 40 in the profession will stay. But in your 30s, if you aren't able to, the system's not supporting you enough to stay in, it's hard. So I would say that, look, it gets easier, definitely, with recognition. When you are known, it gets easier. I never actually encountered a client who had an issue with my being a woman. It was more with another lawyer or the way you may be received in court. And that has changed dramatically just from the atmosphere and the way the judges are conducting themselves today. There's no reason for a woman to feel that the bench will be less receptive to her. I don't think that's the case anymore. And I don't see clients feeling like that either anymore.
Hmm.
But because in a certain area you're surrounded by men, you may feel that, look, nobody's done this. And so you're struggling for a mentor, you're struggling for somebody to guide you or to be in your corner. And so I think it has changed. But yes, my advice to young female lawyers is stick it out. Do not feel in your 20s or 30s, this is so hard. It is so hard. But yes, it definitely gets easier. And you will feel all the better to do that you've done it. And also you owe it to the next generation of women. So, don't bail on them.
Ah, absolutely, absolutely, ma'am. Thank you so much for being so honest with this answer of yours. Now, because we are coming to an end, I'll quickly sort of come to the final set of questions I'd like to ask you, ma'am. Again, because most of our viewers are young lawyers, I think this is also an interesting question. When you're hiring an associate lawyer for your chamber, ma'am, what are some skills and personality traits that you're looking for? Similarly, when an associate is trying to apply to a chamber, how can they ensure that I'll perhaps be a right fit for this place? What's your thinking on this, ma'am?
Okay, so I think the number one thing I look for is work ethic.
Hmm.
Uh, Somebody who's willing to work hard and somebody who doesn't have an entitled attitude. I really think that's the number one thing I look for. Everything else can be learned. So if somebody asks me, what are my work hours? How many days a week are you like? Will I get a 1 day weekend, 2 day weekend, no weekend? Can I go for a yoga class at 5 o'clock every day? No. That person's not doing a job. So to me, those are, and you'll be, it's new to your generation that people actually I think they're valuing work-life balance too young. I
Mm.
don't think you're entitled to work-life balance from 20 to 30. Don't try for it. You should, these are your learning years. You need to work hard. These are the years where you should be like a sponge and try to take every learning opportunity you get. At the same time, yes, people running offices should ensure that it is a happy workplace.
Yeah.
So to me, a toxic workplace is unacceptable. People cannot be run to the ground. Yes, they must have a work-life balance, but a person coming in, if the questions they ask me about learning, and what they learn in my office, that to me, in terms of the kind of work, I like that. To me, that the curiosity. If somebody is more curious about how their lifestyle will be versus the work they'll do, that's a red flag to me.
Mm. Interesting. I think, man, it boils down to ultimately how much fun you're having at your office, what kind of bosses you're working with, and then it's just so much fun to be in office. You don't want to come home
It has
actually.
to be fun. It has to be fun. I mean, to me, anybody who's working in my office, if they're not having a good time, then I'm doing something very, very, very wrong.
Hmm. How do you ensure that your associates are enjoying themselves, they're having a good time?
I mean, I think I do try to involve them in taking
Hmm.
feedback to me on what they would like to learn. So, a new case comes in, and suppose one day it's a environment case at the NGT. And it's not, we may have like 4 of those a year or 5 of those a year. It's not something I do every day. I'll ask all of them. I'll say, who wants to do an NGT matter? Who has that interest? Who, hasn't done this before? Or
Oh,
I've noticed that, somebody has done too many civil suits, but not done any writs, or has not done, has never been to NCLT before because one person was doing all the NCLT work. It just sort of happened like that. And to me, one of the things would you like to be exposed to a forum you're not getting practice in? We have an arbitration, and while maybe two associates were doing the lion's share of arbitrations just because that's how it happened, to make sure that the next arbitration goes to a third person. And that sometimes makes me have to work a little harder because they are unfamiliar.
yes.
But that's when they'll have fun, when they're actually learning all the time.
Wow. That's incredible. Ma'am, I know we're running short of time, but I'd like to take some more minutes and I'd like to ask you a couple of more questions
Shoot,
because I
shoot.
have a million questions running through my head. Ma'am, when you're talking about all of these things, I'm just thinking running a chamber. Right now it's a distant dream, but I mean, when one is actually running it, there's so much to take care of. For instance, something as important as ensuring your juniors are learning, they're not being overworked, sort of, and it's a safe space. Ensuring that clients are coming in, ensuring that good work is going out, and then trivial things like ensuring there's enough water in the tank in the chamber. I mean, I'm just wondering, do you have a system in place for running your chamber? Because there's just so much to do.
So I have a good administrator,
Mm.
my personal assistant, who takes care of everything in the office. She takes care of the accounts, the billing,
Mm.
the water, the procurement, all of that. It wasn't like that. I couldn't afford one when I first started my chambers. So at that time, we did everything, um, down to sort of making sure that there was coffee powder in the kitchen. But so we did everything initially, made the bills ourselves, I mean, as you can pull in more resources, you do. When you can't afford it, when you've just started out, which will be the case for all young lawyers, you
Mm.
do a lot more of that work yourself.
Yes.
So I think, and everybody pitches in. And I think I grew up, my family is very, very high on work ethic. And one of the things my father always raised us with was there is never anything in an organization that is not your job.
Wow.
You may be the CEO of an organization, the managing director of an organization, but if there is a floor that needs to be cleaned, you should be ready to do it.
Mm.
So I never actually thought about all these extra tasks or everything because that was the work ethic I was raised with, which was everything is your job. There is nothing that is not your job, down to like numbering pages of briefs. They've been badly numbered. These are in the non-digital filing days.
Yeah.
You're whitening them out and
Oh,
redoing
wow.
it. We've done it all till like 5 in the morning and then gone for filing the next day.
Wow.
And that's how my 20s were spent, 20s and early 30s. And I look back and I think it was good.
Ah, wonderful. And ma'am, now I'll come finally to the last question that I'd like to get your opinion on. Ma'am, imagine there's a magical wand that can somehow send you back to the year 2000, but the condition is that you have all the skills that you possess now, you have all the knowledge about the profession, all the wisdom, but you are starting out afresh. Are there things you do differently? What are some mistakes you'd avoid? What are some things that you'd perhaps be more experimental about? What would your approach be?
I think I would deal differently with gender
Mm,
than I did then. I felt at that time I had um, to sort of prove to everyone that a woman can do the same things, and they can, and I did have to prove that, and many people before me have already proved it. But everyone's in this and does a little bit better for the next generation. So there were women who were several decades older than me who have really carved this space, including my own former and first boss. But I think what I would have done differently is um, sort of been more confident about it, and stood up for myself just a little bit more than I did in those early years.
mm. That's really interesting, ma'am. And I think I just one more question, ma'am. When you say when you say you'd like to be more confident and stand up for yourself a bit more, for anyone watching right now, how does one do that without coming across as someone who's perhaps thought of as अरे ये कौन आ गया कौन है ये he's just a 23-year-old guy. I mean, so on that, ma'am.
So I think there is a huge difference between arrogance and confidence, and sometimes they get mixed up. And especially when you're young, it's very easy to get into that trap. So I felt that, and I mean, that's why now you can confidently address a situation without being arrogant. And maybe when you're 23 or 21, you can't, which is why perhaps I didn't do it.
Hmm.
But there is a difference. And so certainly, I think you should not get ahead of yourself. But at the same time, I mean, just very quick anecdote. I remember sitting with all my colleagues in the chamber, first few weeks of work. And one of the colleagues who had just joined with me, he said, "So, what does everyone want to do? Like, where do you see yourself when you're 40?" And I said, "I see myself as an arguing counsel." And he looked at me like deadpan expression and he said, "You can't be an arguing counsel." So I said, "Why?" I genuinely asked why. I didn't know why he was saying that. He said, "Because you're a woman."
Oh.
He said, "You can be a very good AOR." And it takes a lot to be a very good AOR. So I'm not taking anything away from that. But he said, "You can be a very good AOR, but you cannot possibly be an arguing counsel." And he was working for a woman who was an arguing counsel. But at that time, she was an AOR, and she went on to, I think, become the first designated senior by the Supreme Court who was a woman. But but at that moment, I was so stunned, and I did say, I mean, it's ridiculous and all of that. But that was the prevailing mindset at the time. And I feel like I should have done more at that time to change it. Now I feel I can, but I didn't feel empowered to do it then.
Hmm. Wow. And I think, ma'am, with this, we can come to an end of today's conversation. I'd like to thank you for being so honest throughout the course of the conversation and answering all my stupid questions with a
Oh,
lot
it
of
was fun.
patience. Uh, it was an incredible honor to be in conversation with you, ma'am. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This was lovely. Thank you so much.
Thank you.